Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aline McNall, and I'll be doing this afternoon's Washington update for the IEEE-USA Washington, D.C. office. Feel free to reach out with questions in the chat as I go along, and I will answer them when I'm finished with the talk. For starters, IEEE-USA has circulated an op-ed to Capitol Hill on open access. The government relations staff are conducting congressional outreach regarding a particular memo out of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And the memo updates public access policies to make the publications and their supporting data resulting from federally funded research publicly accessible without an embargo on the free and public release. The memo does also establish a procedure with the goal of ensuring scientific and research integrity, that it is maintained in the public access process. And then lastly, it addresses coordination with the Office of Science and Technology Policy to ensure equitable delivery of federally funded research and data. On to the National Science Foundation. The NSF, or National Science Foundation, has a request out for information on their new directorate. So the NSF requested input from institutions across all sectors, which includes industry, academia, nonprofits, government, and venture capital community, and others in the STEM community to develop a roadmap for the recent directorate that was established in the CHIPS and Science Act. So this directorate is, of course, the Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships Directorate. And what it does is the RFI tasks the community to come up with kind of a roadmap. So in terms of what was in the legislation, the CHIPS and Science Act does direct TIPS to develop a roadmap to guide investment decisions for use-inspired and translational research over a 3-year time frame. So this is the goal. The goal of this would be to advance U.S. competitiveness and also focus on key technology areas listed in the bill, while in addition to all of that, addressing societal, national, and strategic challenges. So the deadline is July 27th, and IEEE-USA is currently finding a way to respond to this request for information. But if any of you watching are interested in also responding, individuals are encouraged to do so, and that information is available online. And I'm certainly happy to talk about that in the questions should any of you have them. On to NIST. So NIST is leading a discussion with the U.S. government's development of national standards strategy for critical and emerging technology. So that's one of the latest things that NIST is up to these days. It is also working in alignment with the American National Standards Institute for United States Standards on the United States Standards Strategy. So the new standard will emphasize U.S. government support for private sector-led standards. And also engagement with international standards for critical and emerging tech. The objectives include investment, participation, workforce, and integrity, as well as inclusivity. In terms of NIST having some CHIPS news, so NIST is forming a CHIPS advisory committee. So for those of you who might be interested in joining, you can feel free to reach out to our office to learn how to do that, but also there's information on their website. And through the Federal Register also. So feel free to look that up. And if you have any questions about joining, if you're interested in doing so, please feel free to message any of us in the Government Relations Office. We can certainly help with that. NIST did also release a vision for their new National Semiconductor Technology Center. So this is a key component in the NIST section of the CHIPS Act. And we look forward to kind of figuring out how the Semiconductor Technology Center will operate in the future. And very much are excited to watch the Semiconductor Center help the industry in the U.S. To fix supply chain issues, but also just address many policy areas for semiconductor technology. Quick shout out to a friend and colleague over at the Federation of American Scientists. Here's a graph of federal research in terms of appropriations versus the CHIPS authorization. So as we've discussed in previous legislation or legislative updates, the CHIPS bill did authorize but not appropriate funding for NIST and for NSF, as well as the Office of Science. And so here on this graph, again, through the Federation of American Scientists, we have a chart of the funding for the actual agencies, as well as kind of where the CHIPS Act would take that funding should we actually get appropriations at the level of the CHIPS bill. Unfortunately, given our budget environment, we are faced with a very challenging budget environment this year. A lot of discussions about the budget caps and and government shutdowns. And so right now it's unclear about how close we are going to get to the CHIPS authorized levels, but that is something that we are certainly discussing with congressional offices as we move forward to ensure the highest funding possible for NIST and NSF, as well as the DOE Office of Science. In some energy news, the House Energy and Commerce Committee held a hearing today on the FY24 Department of Energy budget. As many of you are aware, the congressional committees in both the House and the Senate do hold hearings on the president's budget. So today's hearing in the Energy and Commerce Committee was on the DOE budget. The House Science is also going to examine the Department of Energy's role in CHIPS and science, as well as the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. So that will be a hearing to talk about these three big bills and what is the Department of Energy's role in kind of producing the outcomes of the bill, which is to help, of course, the American people, but also to promote U.S. competitiveness in STEM fields. Congress is very focused on U.S. competition in general, particularly with our adversaries, and that is kind of the scope of our discussions on energy research in terms of our Hill meetings with members of Congress. In some space news, the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee is certainly looking at reauthorizing NOAA as well as the FAA. IEEE doesn't follow those agencies quite as closely as we follow NASA, and NASA's coming down the pipeline in a little bit, but for now, Congress is focused on NOAA and FAA. So for those of you who are focused on launch and those types of issues, or spectrum, or remote sensing, these are some of the issues that we're starting to look into and certainly starting to discuss with members of Congress. And in some cases, those policy suggestions from our membership will go into the NOAA reauthorization or FAA reauthorization, but a lot of our suggestions will go into the NASA reauthorization bill. In some international space news, the Czech Republic signed the Artemis Accord, so they're the latest country to sign on to the international agreement, and we look forward to hearing more countries in the coming year who agree to sign on to the Artemis Accords. Of course, it is an international agreement, and I know that the State Department has really focused on outreach to nations who we've partnered with in the past on space, and we look forward to hopefully getting more nations to sign on in the future. The Department of Defense is looking at creating a commercial space reserve. So more on that in the future, but I just wanted to flag that for those of you who are interested in defense research. And as for NASA budget discussion, so obviously we're looking at the FY24 appropriations process, which is underway, and do look forward to working with members of Congress to answer kind of questions about the different directorates at NASA and where we are in terms of the reach of NASA in terms of congressional districts. Obviously, the space program has NASA centers, but we look forward to hearing from our members about what is going on in terms of space-related research in each of the congressional districts. This helps build support for the agency as Congress looks to both reauthorize it, but also discuss with the administration kind of its proposal for NASA. So a proposal for the House from House Republicans is that we would shield NASA from the proposed budget cuts. So there's a lot of discussion about what would be cut in terms of a budget deal. And right now there's discussion about having NASA be separate from those budget discussions in terms of what are the proposed cuts. Veterans Affairs are also kind of being separated like NASA, so that proposed cuts would not affect Veterans Affairs or space. The Senate is taking a different approach and is looking at all sorts of what we call discretionary funding. So different agencies that are doing the different science programs, most of those are considered discretionary funding, and that right now is kind of on the chopping block in the House in terms of House Republican discussions. But the Senate seems more interested in protecting discretionary funding, including NASA, but may or may not take that approach of having NASA be with Veterans Affairs in terms of shielding from all proposed cuts. NASA does have many missions, so obviously the Artemis Accords and the Artemis program have received a lot of attention, but obviously NASA does many missions, and in terms of the science directorate versus the aeronautics programs and the different missions, we're kind of in negotiations right now about agency priorities and how to move forward to ensure strong funding there. In Department of Defense news, the DoD did announce $18 million in Defense Established Research Program to stimulate competitive research, or DEP score, to 28 collaborative academic teams. This is of note because IEEE has advocated in the past for EPSCoR programs, particularly the National Science Foundation, in that it is a funding stream for areas of the country that don't necessarily receive the same level of federal funding as other areas of the country. We have technology hubs, of course, in the US, and we're very pleased that those have been thriving, but we're looking at the issue of how can we include and promote STEM funding in areas of the country that are less well represented. So the DEF score program is, of course, for the Department of Defense to do that. And we look forward to hearing which of our members have actually benefited from that $18 million in funding announced by the DoD. The DoD also released their National Defense Science and Technology Strategy recently. So that it has three focuses. It's focusing on the joint mission, but also creating and fielding capabilities at speed and scale. So the fight or flight now issue is certainly one, can we support basic research versus research that is going to go in the hands of our warfighters tomorrow for a war or for a conflict. So that's kind of the balance of funding within the DoD issue. And so this National Defense Science and Technology Strategy does look at creating and fielding capabilities for speed as well as scale. And the last issue addressed in the strategy is to ensure that the foundational research and development funding exists and is as strong as possible. So we look forward to working with the DoD as they carry out that strategy, and certainly look forward to congressional discussions as it relates to that strategy. But those are two kind of pieces of news from the defense world. And I will certainly take any questions, comments, or wise remarks from any of you who are listening live. And if you are listening after the broadcast has ended, please feel free to reach out. My email is a.mcnall@IEEE.org. And feel free to put your questions in the chat. Also of note on our social media channels, we've posted the RFI as well as the standard strategy as well as the National Strategy for Critical and Emerging Technology and the national the other strategy documents. So. Seeing no questions or comments, I think we can close today's broadcast, but I do encourage all of you to look at these documents, and please reach out if you have any feedback about them or if you would like to join one of the advisory committees on CHIPS or respond to the RFI, for example. We look forward to working with our members on all of those things, and certainly wish you a good 2 weeks, and I will see you all in 2 weeks for the next Washington update.